Hello, everyone, and welcome to this training on supported decision-making and the CARE Act. This is for those implementing the CARE Act in California, and we're going to be talking about one of the important concepts today of supported decision-making. So let's go on the next slide and look at some of what we'll cover today. So the first section, we're going to be talking about what is supported decision-making, do a definition, then see how it interacts with the CARE Act and the law in California, and then talk about key concepts and principles and start looking at what does this look like in practice with a case example. Then the second process is going to really be tying in those concepts into the CARE Act specifically. So we'll look at SDM or supported decision-making in the CARE Act, look at some of the roles and how those different roles, especially the volunteer supporter, can implement supported decision-making throughout. And then, of course, we always like to pull in scenarios of a CARE Act participant and what that could look like in practice. On the next slide, highlight some of the learning objectives. At the end of the session, participants should have an increased ability to explain what supported decision-making, how it can be promoted with individuals who are eligible for the CARE Act, understand and demonstrate familiarity with the continuum of decision-making supports for all parties, and then begin to apply the supported decision-making to the volunteer supporter role. So before we jump into the content, I want to introduce our presenters today. And on the next slide, we see that we have Dari Pogosh and Barry Jacobs, and I'm going to have them introduce themselves. So Dari, why don't you start and give a little background about you and your role in supported decision-making, and then we'll hear from Barry.
Thanks, Patricia. I'm a senior consultant at HMA, but I'm also an attorney by training, and I started out my career representing individuals with mental illness for DC's Protection and Advocacy Program for people with disabilities. And when I was representing clients, supported decision-making was really coming up as a legal concept and an idea in the advocacy world. And so we began implementing that framework with our clients. And I have also worked in supported decision-making in a variety of local legislative efforts, as well as policy work. I've done a lot of work on adult guardianship, working for the American Bar Association's Commission on Law and Aging, and again, creating practical tools for attorneys and other professionals to use supportive decision-making. And finally, I've worked for DC's Department of Aging and Community Living, where I led adult protective services and worked on a strategic plan to support the self-determination of the people that we served. So I'm really excited to see how California is taking on supported decision-making as a California value, and really looking forward to talking today about how it's going to be implemented through the CARE Act. Go ahead, Barry.
Thank you, Dari. And my name is Barry Jacobs. I am a principal in the Philadelphia office of Health Management Associates, and I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I worked for nearly 30 years in behavioral health and medical settings. I worked extensively with individuals with all kinds of illnesses, including serious mental illness. I also am something of a national expert on family caregiving, and have worked both clinically and on a policy level to support families, help support families who are caring for loved ones with these serious and chronic illnesses, and have a lot of experience working as a psychotherapist with families who are trying to best help individuals with schizophrenia in particular. So it's my pleasure to be here with you, and like Dari, I'm very excited that California is embarking on this new journey.
Thanks, Dari, and thanks, Barry. Why don't we jump into the section, and Dari's going to take us through that an introduction to supported decision-making and some of the key concepts, and begin to show how it interacts with CARE Act. So Dari?
Thanks, Patricia. So welcome to your introduction to supported decision-making. Next slide, please. Here's a definition that I always like to level set with when I talk about supported decision-making. Supported decision-making refers to supports and services that help an adult with a disability make his or her own decisions by using friends, family members, professionals, and other people they trust. First, to help understand the issues and choices and ask questions. Next, to receive explanations in language they understand. And finally, to communicate their own decisions to others. So I invite you to think about during the course of this presentation and beyond, what are the supports and services that would enable an individual to make their own decisions? It's important to understand that supported decision-making evolved as a theory in response to the long history of the suppression of the rights of people with disabilities to make their own decisions. So first and foremost, it really affirms the right that all of us have to self-determination. And self-determination, a big part of that means being able to make your own decisions. But the second part I want to stress is this isn't just about making decisions as an individual, but really having the supports and services that you need to make those decisions. And if those supports and services are provided by the state, they're provided by family and friends and a trusted network. And that's what we're going to really get into today, is the implementation of this framework. Next slide. So California is really taking on supported decision-making as a central California value and a value that's essential to the CARE Act. The CARE Act statute says self-determination and civil liberties are important California values that can be advanced and protected for individuals with these untreated severe mental illnesses, with the provision of legal counsel for care proceedings, agreements, and plans, as well as the promotion of supported decision-making. So the supported decision-making model is a tool to advance self-determination and civil liberties through the CARE Act. And I do want to say we're talking today about best practices for implementing supported decision-making. We'll talk later about how those in the making network, including the volunteer supporter, can facilitate supported decision-making. But this is a model. These are best practices. And of course, we understand that they won't always work out as perfectly as we describe them today in reality. And the point is not that there's not a pass or fail for supported decision-making. There's a lot of trial and error in applying this framework and figuring out what works. And in a person-centered, with a person-centered model, of course, the supported decision-making tool really has to be developed and applied to meet the individual needs of the person who's being supported. Next slide. So supported decision-making is one of several options that we all have for making decisions. And oftentimes when we talk about supporting individuals with disabilities and making decisions, we want to look at the wide spectrum of decision-making supports. Here are just a few options that could be used on their own or in conjunction with supported decision-making. Medical and financial powers of attorney, authorized representative forms, healthcare directives, including psychiatric advance directives, and there will be a training given on PADS, on psychiatric advance directives, during the course of this training series, release of information forms, and representative payees. So again, the point is that supported decision-making as a model can really come into play during any of these other decision-making support relationships and arrangements. Next slide. So I'd like to ask you to think about, what decisions have you made today? It's from where I'm presenting, it's lunchtime. So I've already thought about what should I eat for breakfast. I decided whether or not to wake up early and exercise. But perhaps you've also had some bigger decisions to think about today. Are you considering buying a new car? Are you making a decision about your educational path? Maybe there's a relationship that you're evaluating or reevaluating. And when you make those decisions, what factors influence them? Did you make every decision on your own? Did you ask someone for input? Did they give you advice? Did you take it? Supported decision-making is articulating the process that most of us already use to make decisions, which is seeking support or advice or opinions from people in our network, and we often go to different people for different kinds of decisions. And we don't have to take the advice, right? And that's another important thing to remember about supported decision-making is ultimately this is about the person's right to make their own decision. But I put this slide out here because, again, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, supported decision-making is a response to the long history of substitute decision-making that has been enforced for people with disabilities. And it really signifies a paradigm shift from substituted to supported decision-making. So this is a model that some of us may take for granted if our authority or capacity to make our own decisions has never been questioned, but one that is so important for people who historically are not afforded the right or given the support that they need to make their own decisions. Next slide, please. So I want to talk for a few minutes about what are the factors that influence decision-making. Because there's a lot of factors that play into how we make decisions, and they're not going to be the same for all of us. If I start out with culture at the bottom of the circle, for some cultures, supported decision-making will seem like a really kind of intuitive framework. Of course, the individual makes a decision. The individual has the right to consult with whatever trusted supporters they want to go to get advice or help them to understand the information that's being communicated, to evaluate the pros and cons of the decision and to come to a conclusion. But in other cultures, that's really not the case. You may have a culture where one designated family member or respected member of a community is responsible for making decisions on behalf of a large group of people, for example. And so I want to recognize that this is not a concept that will be intuitive or culturally familiar to many individuals. I have English proficiency here because I think, communication is such a big part of how we make decisions and our ability to make our own decisions. And if you think about, for example, perhaps a family where you have parents who may not speak English and the children are the translators for that family, children may end up making a lot of decisions on behalf of their parents just by virtue of the translation process. Family dynamics, we're going to really get into this when we talk about the role of the volunteer supporter. In many ways, a supported decision-making model where the role of the supporter is not to give their own opinion or to judge the decision, but rather to truly support the person to make their own decision can be really counter to a lot of family dynamics where, those dynamics have existed a lot longer than this concept of supported decision-making framework. And families may have their own way of making decisions historically where there are plenty of opinions given, there's lots of influence, there's a lot of other factors at play. Financial status, I think if there are limited resources, again, it can really influence how we make decisions. As an attorney representing individuals with psychiatric disabilities, I've seen many times when families make decisions when financial resources are really limited. Families often make a lot of decisions together as a whole because they have to focus not just on the needs of each individual, but what it would take for the family as a unit to survive. Race, ethnicity, class, and education level, these are crucial factors in how individuals make decisions and also how their decisions are perceived by others. And I want to just bring this to the CARE Act context for a moment, because I think when you talk about court proceedings, when you talk about mental health treatment, there's a lot of work that's been done, obviously, on the role of bias and discrimination that plays into these proceedings. And so I think many of the respondents many of the individuals who come to participate in the CARE Act may not be accustomed to having their voices heard, to their decisions being respected as reasonable decisions to people in their lives, whether it's family, friends, but also professionals, behavioral health support professionals, court personnel, um, they may not be accustomed to being their decisions being honored and asked, well, why did you come to that decision in the first place? What were you thinking? So these factors, this is what makes the person. And this is why we have to, again, apply a truly person-centered, individualized approach to every supported decision-making framework. Next slide. One question that comes up a lot is, are there limitations to using supported decision-making? Are there instances where it simply won't work? So I want to preface this conversation by making clear that supported decision-making is a decision-making framework. There's no bright line rule to when supported decision-making is not applicable. We can come up with some scenarios where it may be more likely that supported decision-making is not possible. And we can also talk about ways to possibly address those scenarios to ensure that the person, whenever possible, preserves their right to make their own decisions with the needed services and supports. So, for example, what if the person is threatening to harm themselves or others? First, in that instance, the first thing that the supporter should do is call emergency response. I also want to point out that according to the CARE Act statute, the supporter should not make decisions on behalf of the person unless they're threatening to harm themselves or others. So the CARE Act statute does anticipate this scenario. I think something that's a little harder is what if the person doesn't want to engage in supported decision-making? So in this case, the supporter and people who are potential members of a supported decision-making network can talk to the person about why they might not want to participate, can try to get to the root of the concern and perhaps address it, and then provide the supports and services necessary for the person to make their own decisions. But ultimately, of course, it's up to the person whether or not they want help making decisions. And we need part of respecting their self-determination and their right to autonomy is respecting their right to make that decision about getting help to make more decisions. And then finally, what if the person isn't communicating their expressed wishes? So in that instance, first, it's important that the volunteer supporter, if they're aware of any previously known wishes or legal documentation of the person that articulates those wishes, like a power of attorney or a psychiatric advance directive or a living will, the supporter can, of course, advocate with the person's treatment team and whoever else at that point is making decisions on behalf of the person to consult with these previously known wishes. But of course, if the person truly can't participate in making decisions, then no, they cannot in the moment use a supported decision-making framework. Now, there are other examples that come up a lot. People will ask me, well, what if the person wants to make a medical decision that's contrary to the medical team's recommendation? So in that instance, supported decision-making absolutely applies. The person has the right to make their own decision with the supports and services necessary to do so, whether or not that decision is in alignment with what their medical team is recommending. What if the person wants to pay their cable bill instead of paying their rent for the month and is at risk of eviction? Again, in that instance, supported decision-making is completely appropriate. And as we've discussed, ultimately the person should make the final decision about how to allocate their resources. Social and relationship decisions, this also comes up. What if the person is in a relationship and the supporter is concerned that it's not a healthy relationship? So again, unless the person's at imminent risk of harm, supported decision-making means really helping the person to make their own decisions, but not saying no in this case because you're about to make what I think is a bad decision, quote unquote, that, we can't have a supported decision-making arrangement right now. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So let's see how supported decision-making might work in action. This is Sean. He has a diagnosis of diabetes and opioid use disorder, and he's currently unhoused. His doctor recommended he amputate his toe, which has gangrene, or he'll lose his foot. Sean's worried he will relapse if he's medicated for surgery, and he decides to forego the surgery. So this is obviously a really serious situation. This is a real situation. It's based on some cases that I've had in my legal career, and I'm certain many of you in the audience are familiar with these kinds of really tough decisions. Is supported decision making? How would it play out in this situation? Next slide. So I want to stress that. What's the ideal outcome? The ideal outcome here, I don't have an answer for the specifics of what will happen. There's a question, will Sean have the surgery or not? And under a supported decision-making framework, whether or not Sean has the surgery is not relevant to the ideal outcome. The ideal outcome would be that Sean makes his own decision with all the information that he needs, and that he feels that his voice has been heard, and that he's had the right to self-determination to decide what the next step should be. Some ways that Sean's supporter can help to facilitate Sean making his own decision include being able to answer, did Sean have all the information he needed to make an informed decision? Did he talk to the surgeon about medication options for someone with opioid use disorder? Did his psychiatrist participate in the treatment plan? And did Sean get to tell the doctor how he felt? What I've seen that can be really powerful with a supported decision-making model is often the person who's at the center of the framework, who's making the decision, has never really felt like their voice has been heard. Like they had an opportunity to say, whether it's to their doctor or to their financial advisor or to their family, but this is what I want. This is how I feel. And also this is why. This is how I've thought through this decision and come to this determination. And so supported decision-making can be a really powerful tool to ensure that the person's voice is heard. Next slide.
Yeah, Dari, before you go on to the next slide, if I just may add a concept to this that I think is very helpful, and that's the concept of dignity of risk. That the specific clinical situation here about whether to have a toe amputated is one that all individuals in this situation struggle with, whether they have schizophrenia or not. And we allow folks regularly to take the risk of not having their toe amputated because they don't want to lose the toe, and then in the hopes that antibiotics alone will be enough to stop the gangrene. But we, with an individual who has schizophrenia, sometimes we just doubt their judgment. But in fact, through the CARE Act, through SDM, we are offering that dignity of risk, the opportunity for Sean to have the dignity of being able to make his own decision, even if it entails some risk. So just wanted to share that with you.
Thanks, Barry. I appreciate you bringing that up. That's absolutely right. And, going back to the facts of this case, Sean has some very legitimate concerns about why he doesn't want to amputate his toe. He's concerned about relapse if he takes medication related to the surgery. And so part of that conversation is about weighing those risks, right? There's a risk of relapse versus the risk of losing your toe. And then, perhaps, and then what we can further medical considerations that might come after that, or complications that might result from that. So this idea of being able to take risks and balancing those risks is definitely part of supported decision-making. Next slide. So we're closing our introduction to supported decision-making, and we're going to be moving on to looking at how supported decision-making applies to the CARE Act proceedings. So I'd ask you to think about how you would summarize supported decision-making as a framework and make a note of questions you have about how it might apply to the CARE Act. And Barry, I'm wondering if you have any questions or thoughts before we move into the CARE Act section.
No, Dari, I think, as you pointed out earlier, SDM is not a 100% guaranteed solution. It's a framework for trying to maximize the ability of individuals with serious mental illness to exercise as much self-determination as possible, knowing that there may be times when they are so impaired by their disease that they may not be able to fully engage in the SDM process. But I think it's a very good framework for this idea of maximizing self-determination, and knowing that that there are times when maybe someone can use SDM for some types of decisions, but perhaps not for others. And so I hopefully we'll get more into that as we continue.
Thanks, Barry. Okay, we can move on. So now we're going to talk about supported decision-making in the CARE Act process. Next slide, please. I want to speak just for a moment about person-centered planning as a corollary or a tool that can be used within a supported decision-making framework in the CARE Act. So the components of the CARE process are structured to ensure that the diverse and unique needs of each respondent are heard, recognized, and met. Person-centered planning means prioritizing the care respondent's strengths, capabilities, preferences, lifestyle, and culture. And I think this is really meaningful in the context of supported decision-making. Making a decision, it's not just about a person's capacity to make a decision, but it's also about where are they coming from? What's their personal story? What's their culture? What's their background that is influencing how they make a decision? And so that's why I really appreciate this person-centered approach that's looking at the whole person when they make a decision. With the help of the supported decision-making approach, the different roles in the CARE process can use person-centered planning as a guide for supporting the care respondent through the process and ensuring their priorities, choices, and decisions are heard. Next slide. So here we have a walkthrough of supported decision-making throughout the CARE proceedings. And we're going to talk for a couple of minutes about where in the process are there opportunities to incorporate the supported decision-making approach. Some of you may have seen the slide, which was part of an earlier presentation on the CARE Act. It's a terrific model and a terrific diagram of how supported decision-making of how the CARE proceedings moves forward. And in the next slide, I'm going to talk more about which parts specifically are really going to be meaningful for supported decision-making. Next slide. So supported decision-making, I think can be used throughout the CARE Act. But again, I want to be clear, if you have something like a petition where the person certainly didn't file that petition, and so that petition is not going to be about what the person wants or what their decisions are. And so I don't expect supported decision-making in that part of the process or the county report. But when we get to this idea of voluntary engagement, that's a great example of when supported decision-making might really be helpful, because when you get to that point, the person has a big decision to make. They can decide that they want to engage with behavioral health services. And that's a great opportunity to make sure that they have the services and supports they need to make that decision. The care plan and agreement, again, is going to be a really important part where supported decision-making really has to happen to meet to really be in compliance with the CARE Act statute, where the person is such an involved part of the whole process. Psychiatric advance directives, this is a little more complicated because this is something that's written in anticipation of a time where a person may not be able to make their own decisions. And there's a lot of interesting work being done on incorporating supported decision-making clauses into those directives. And I'm going to hold off on that for now because that's the topic of a subsequent training. And then finally, the graduation plan, where the person will be making decisions about the future. And it's another great opportunity to incorporate supported decision-making. Next slide. And at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to my colleague, Barry Jacobs, and he's going to be introducing Ray. So
Thank
Barry,
you.
go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Dari. And Chloe, if you can show the rest of the slide, thank you. So we looked at the case example of Sean, hypothetical example of Sean, and this is another hypothetical example of someone we'll call Ray. Ray is a middle-aged man who has multiple diagnoses, schizophrenia, alcohol use disorder, and unfortunately, like many people who've been on atypical antipsychotics for many years, he has developed very significant type 2 diabetes with diabetic complications. Over the years, he's been engaged at various times in mental health treatment, but is not currently engaged. His history is one of using atypical antipsychotics inconsistently. And as you likely know, this is not an unusual history. People don't like the side effects of antipsychotics, or maybe they have strong feelings about taking any medication. Recently, Ray has had a series of emergency room visits, specifically for his neuropathic foot pain, one of his diabetic complications, and he's been unhoused for some time. So he has been meeting regularly with a homeless outreach worker who has been concerned about him, thought he would be a good candidate for the CARE Act services, and has referred him for CARE Act proceedings. And as part of those proceedings, Ray it's understood that he has the ability to choose a volunteer supporter to help facilitate the communication of his wishes. And for that volunteer supporter role, he's chosen his older sister. Next slide, please. So where is Ray in this CARE Act process? Well, so he is now at the point of creating a care agreement. It's been he's had an initial evaluation. It's not agreed readily to treatment, and he has not agreed readily to the treatment plan that has been proposed to him. So he and in the court or in the process of making a care agreement. The behavioral health agency that had done an initial evaluation has made the following recommendations: that he complete a medication evaluation and follow the prescriber's recommendations, that he pursue treatment options specifically for alcohol use disorder, and because his diabetes is uncontrolled, that he see a primary care provider for his medical conditions. Could you show the rest of the slide, Chloe? So what does Ray want? Ray is fortunately able to communicate his preferences. And like I think many real life situations, Ray doesn't fully agree or fully disagree with the behavioral health agency's recommendations. What he does is he picks and chooses. So he is willing to see a psychiatrist for an evaluation, something actually I find rather surprising because he's been loath to see psychiatry in the past. But even though he's willing to see a psychiatrist at this point, he's really not willing to commit beforehand to taking medicines. And nor is he interested in treatment for his alcohol use disorder. And he's not interested in seeing a primary care provider about his diabetes. Maybe the thing that he's most interested in is that he's interested in potentially getting financial support and housing through the CARE Act process. So Ray is pretty clear about what he wants and also what he doesn't want. Next slide, please. And so we're going to just touch briefly upon the role of Ray's sister as his volunteer supporter. And you heard Dory talk a little bit about this role before. And there is a separate presentation that we have going to put together on volunteer supporters. But the question here is how can Ray's sister help him understand his options to make decisions related to his care agreement? I mean, Ray's sister has known him since he was born, knows his personality, knows the struggles he's had. And I think, she's had to go through training in SDM and in the CARE Act process to understand that being an older sister and being a volunteer supporter are not the same role. The volunteer supporter is much more of a role of a facilitator rather than an older sister who might have been someone who told him what to do, maybe even a second mom to him growing up. So with Ray's consent, the older sister will be able to talk to the behavioral health agency's case manager and any other providers to better understand the recommendations, the treatment recommendations that have been made for Ray. With Ray's consent, the older sister will be able to make sure that Ray's case manager, the behavioral health case manager, understands what Ray's preferences and priorities are. And maybe most importantly, the older sister's job as a volunteer supporter is to really sit down with Ray, probably not in one conversation, probably in multiple conversations at different times, to make sure that Ray fully comprehends all the different options so that he can make the most informed decision possible. But she'll go through each option with him, asking him what he thinks, what he thinks are the pros and cons of each option, and then really giving him as much latitude in identifying what are the treatments and services he would like included in his care agreement. Next slide, please. I just want to mention at this point, I did mention that we have a separate presentation on the supporter role, and that we have also DHCS and HMA have put together a brief specifically on the supporter role in the CARE Act. And this will be available on the careact.org website, as you can see below, but it goes over a lot of the specific roles and principles of the volunteer supporter. Next slide, please. So in order to help volunteer supporters do their job as well as possible, we are, as part of the CARE Act process, volunteer supporters will be provided with training, not just the brief, but presentations such as this one on the role and the principles, and they'll have an opportunity to understand how they can use supported decision making as a framework for talking with individuals with SMI to enable them to be as self-determining as possible. Next slide, please. And part of this, as I mentioned just a moment ago, is for the older sister to help Ray really anticipate the consequences of any particular option that he would choose. If he chooses to not use medication, what are the potential consequences of that? If he chooses to use medication, what are the potential consequences of that? And for Ray to best understand what might be in the long run in his best interest. What's very important here, and we'll continue to stress over and over again as we talk about volunteer supporters, is their job is not to guide the respondent, not to even lecture the respondent, but really, more importantly, to help frame a conversation for them so that they can make the best choice possible for themselves. Next slide, please. So we've been talking about 4 different types of roles in the CARE Act process up to this point. And we're going to unpack them just a little bit now. So the first is obviously the respondent. And we mentioned Ray, and we mentioned the volunteer supporter role, his older sister. We've just mentioned in passing the County Behavioral Health Agency's role in doing that initial evaluation and making some initial recommendations for the care agreement. And then the court obviously has an enormously important role to play in this. So let's just spend a moment unpacking those a little bit more. Next slide, please. So we've already mentioned a number of these things. We want to help Ray use supported decision-making to best communicate his preferences, his choices, and his priorities to ultimately inform the care agreement and plan. We want to help him, as I said, use that list of pros and cons in coming to that decision. And we want to in the process, the CARE Act process, we want to help him develop a psychiatric advance directive, which, by the way, is also going to be the basis of another presentation. And then the respondent has that opportunity to involve the volunteer supporter in their visits with the behavioral health provider and with their legal counsel. Next slide, please. For the volunteer supporter, as we've mentioned, her role is as much as possible to listen to Ray's concerns and really provide him with a non-directive, non-judgmental audience, and to pose questions to him to help him better articulate and better organize his thoughts so that he can express his preferences and goals. And that part of that may involve taking notes for the respondent, making lists or drawing a diagram for the respondent, doing a little bit of what we call reflective listening and reflecting back to Ray some of the statements that he has made so that Ray could hear kind of what this sounds like and to help him take in what the meaning, what the consequences of these choices may be. And as I mentioned, maybe having this conversation about his preferences and priorities at one time or another. He may be more clear-headed at certain times of day. He may be just more inclined to have this conversation on one day versus another. With Ray's permission, his consent to attend his behavioral health appointments, and really to remind Ray again and again that these decisions are his. So I'm going to now turn this back over to Dari to take us through.
Thanks, Barry. We can go to the next slide. So let's talk with a little more detail about how CARE Act, all the roles in the CARE Act process can use supported decision-making, and also just not just in terms of directly implementing it, but supporting its implementation even as a third party. So for example, we have the Behavioral Health Agency. So how can the BH agency respect supported decision-making as a tool? The agency can listen to Ray's concerns, respect the role of Ray's supporter as someone who's supporting Ray to make his own decisions. And I think this is really key to the role of the BH agency, is to really acknowledge, recognize, and respect the supporter as an integral part of this process. So long, of course, as Ray wants the supporter to be present. So when the Behavioral Health Agency meets with Ray and his supporter, if that's according to Ray's wishes, and any other professionals who may be able to help Ray make his own decisions. So here, the agency can also help by ensuring that, again, it's not just about the supports, it's about the services too. So what are the services that aren't, who are the other professionals or services that could be provided to help Ray make his own decision? Be direct, speak with Ray. How can we work together to provide those services that address your priorities? And apply a multidisciplinary approach that includes a psychiatrist to problem solve Ray's concerns about medication. So this is really about that care plan meeting or that treatment team meeting where Ray is an integral part of the process. His supporter is there if he wants his supporter there too. And they're going over the pros and cons together of the decision. They're discussing the treatment, and Ray is articulating his concerns, his questions about medication. Essentially, this is all about making sure Ray has as much information as possible to assist him with decision-making, and that information is being presented in a manner that's accessible to Ray too. So it's not about just giving him some paperwork and saying, go ahead and read it on your own. It's saying, here's the information, and Barry spoke to this earlier with a diagram to help you understand. Would you like us to write something down? Is it about repeating the information in shorter pieces? Does it matter what time of day we talk? So all of these tools that are in place to provide the information to Ray in as person-centered a manner as possible. Next slide. What's the role of the care court in respecting supported decision-making as a tool? So the court confirms that Ray has chosen his sister as his supporter. And if Ray doesn't have a supporter in place when the court proceedings commence, the court can ask, do you have a supporter? Do you need one? Make sure that if Ray wants a supporter, that everything has been done to identify one for him. The court can also confirm there's no irresolvable conflict between Ray and his sister as his supporter. And again, I think most important, respect the role of Ray's supporter. As someone who's supporting Ray to make his own decisions, what does that mean? Honoring the person's presence in court, not questioning why they're there, checking in with Ray. Do you want your supporter to be here? And if you do, being welcoming to that supporter and supporting their participation as a supporter of Ray's decisions. And I think for counsel, what this means is if Ray asks, including his sister in meetings and conversations. Next slide, please. So as Ray goes through the CARE Act process, supported decision-making can help to ensure that he has all the information he needs to make his own decisions, that he talks through the pros and cons of his decisions. He understands the possible outcomes and consequences of those decisions, that his volunteer supporter and others in his supported decision-making network, because he may have others who he also turns to support him for perhaps a specific kind of decision, have been part of the process, that he feels that he's been respected and heard. And I've said this before, but I'll say it again. Supported decision-making is about the person having the opportunity to articulate what they want and ensuring that their voice is truly heard. And that is the only way that they can make self-directed decisions to the greatest extent possible. Next slide. Here are just one link to, this is a great resource. If you're looking for tools for supported decision-making, here are some examples of written supported decision-making agreements from the National Resource for Supported Decision-Making. I just want to be clear that to use the supported decision-making model within the CARE Act does not require a written supported decision-making agreement. But I think it is helpful to go through some of these because they give a good sense of what are the kinds of decisions that individuals might want to include in an agreement. And they also, some of them really give a good example of presenting information in plain language to ensure that everyone, or as many people as possible, can understand the document and can access it. Next slide. So Barry, I want to ask you, and everyone who's listening, what are the biggest challenges to implementing the principles of supported decision-making during care proceedings?
I think my opinion, the foremost barrier is the acuity of illness. If people are simply too ill at a given time to really engage in this process, then SDM is not going to be helpful. And we're looking at other options at that point. My hope is that we find the right time to approach individuals when, in the course of their disease, they aren't suffering such severe symptoms, and they're more willing and able to engage in this process and really benefit from this framework to help them make the best decision possible, to feel respected and heard, and then really to participate in getting them, hopefully getting them treatments that'll be of real benefit to them and to their families. And I was going to ask you, Daria, what are your thoughts?
What do I think? Well, I agree with you. I would say, again, it's important. And this is really where I think the roles within the CARE Act, when we're talking about the court, the behavioral health agency, they have a duty here to check in. So if supported decision-making isn't a viable option in week 1, it may be appropriate to bring up in week 3 or 4 or 8. And so it's important that we're always checking in with the person to figure out, okay, when might be a good time to ask, is this something you've thought about? And this is a corollary to the volunteer supporter too, right? If the person doesn't want a volunteer supporter immediately, it doesn't mean they can't have one appointed later on. And that's really taking the person-centered approach and understanding where the person is in their behavioral health journey and when they may be able to engage in a supported decision-making arrangement. I think the other big challenge is setting up a supported decision-making network, we're talking about a lot of individuals who are likely disenfranchised and isolated, may have cut off ties with family and friends, and may also just not have a history of having anyone who they trust or they feel has respected their ability, their capacity, their right to make their own decisions. And I do think counties will face challenges in implementation and identifying supporters, and also in recognizing these arrangements. One option will be to go to other local community organizations like a NAMI chapter, for example, or a homeless outreach organization. But this will be a logistical challenge, identifying the appropriate supporter. And I just want to recognize that, because like we said in the beginning, we're talking about a framework and we're talking about the best practices for implementing that framework. But we recognize the realistic challenges, and we welcome this conversation because we're really interested in addressing them to the greatest extent possible.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, Daria. You said one word that I just want to underscore, and that's the word trust. And that the whole point of SDM is to engender more trust. But unless there's a certain basic trust for someone with severe mental illness to engage in this process, if they have paranoid delusions about it from the get-go, then we really can't go through this with them. It's not going to be of help to them. And so somehow or other, as you point out, we need to have that SDM network in place, people who are well trained in this process and who have real strong engagement skills to be able to win trust easily, and then to use this SDM process to engender further trust in working towards some sort of care agreement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Barry. I appreciate that. And, I think including SDM in the CARE Act statute really just demonstrates California's commitment to ensuring that this CARE Act process is based on that trust that you just described. And so, I look forward to, I'm sure as the act, the proceedings roll out, that we'll hear about more challenges too. And I think that this discussion, and this is why we chose to end with this question, because it's really about recognizing what these challenges are and then thinking about, okay, how can we address them as they come up? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our colleague, Patricia.
Sorry, and thanks, Barry. So just as a recap, we wanted to share, again, these objectives. So the goal is that you feel better prepared and have an increased ability to explain why supported decision-making is a fundamental principle of the CARE Act, demonstrate that familiarity with the continuum of decision-making, supports for all parties involved in the care process. And Dari and Barry talked about a few of those: the role of the volunteer supporter, EH agency, courts and counsel, and also all the ways in which supported decision-making can be incorporated into the process and those different inflection points. And then applied supported decision-making as a decision-making model to that volunteer supporter role, which there are available resources, as Barry mentioned, both the brief and the module that specifically goes over the role of the volunteer supporter. On the next slide, we're going to outline some next steps for you. Visit careact.org for resources, including recordings of other trainings, and also to submit TA requests and questions. If you have further questions about what supported decision-making can look like, please reach out so we can provide that support. Also, make sure that you are signed up for a communication listserv. You can also do that by going to the website and completing the form, which will be linked in these notes. On the next slide, we wanted to share some resources for you. And let's just go to the next slide. Dari mentioned one earlier where you can go to get resources. And here are just some other places you can turn to for more information. You see some training guides and some tools for doing formal agreements that Dari mentioned. and to learn more about supported decision making. So again, thank you, and please reach out if you have questions or technical assistance requests.